everyone, and welcome to our presentation, Mercy in the Old Testament, the Fruit of the Womb. This lecture is in honor of our dear and esteemed colleague, Father Richard J. Clifford of the Society of Jesus, and is made possible through the generous support of the Kitts family. While she could not be with us tonight, I want to thank Anne Marie Kitts and the Kitts family for their extraordinary dedication to the School of Theology and Ministry. It's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Andrew R. Davis is Associate Professor of Old Testament here at Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. He is a native of Raleigh, North Carolina, where he first discovered his love of ancient languages in Mrs. Ruth Ann Morton's 7th grade Latin class. Mrs. Morton, if you happen to be watching virtually, may God bless you and your fellow teachers. God bless you and thank you for choosing to be a teacher. Andrew then studied classics at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and after a year in the Jesuit Volunteer Corps in Oakland, California, and another year teaching English in Austria, he attended the Weston Jesuit School of Theology, where he earned an MTS degree. He then pursued doctoral studies at Johns Hopkins University, earning an MA and a PhD. Research for his dissertation included a year as Kress Fellow at the Albright Institute of Archaeological Research in Jerusalem. Before coming to Boston College, Professor Davis taught for 4 years at the Seattle University School of Theology and Ministry. His book, The Book of Amos, and its audiences, Prophecy, Poetry, and Rhetoric, will be published by Cambridge University Press later this year. A terrific colleague, we are delighted to welcome him with us at this year's Clifford Lecture Speaker. Welcome, Professor Davis.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Mick, for that introduction. Thank you to Megan DeDios and Cara Sullivan for all the work you've done to make this evening happen. And thank you all for being here, especially happy to welcome my wife and kids who are here, especially happy to welcome my parents who I think are watching online. I don't know about Miss Morton or not, but maybe, who knows. And also any guests who are celebrating their birthday, I'm especially happy to have them here with me tonight. And I'm especially grateful to offer this talk in honor of Dick Clifford, who, as many of you know, is probably the most impactful mentor I've had in my life, honestly, besides Miss Morton. And I think that it's hard to imagine a scholar that I admire more than Dick. And not just a scholar, but a Jesuit priest, a human being. He embodies, in my view, the ideal of what it means to be a scholar, and someone who approaches academics from a ministerial perspective. And so, for all those reasons, he's just a beloved mentor, and I couldn't be more honored to offer this lecture tonight in his honor. And I also wanted to say a word about Anne Marie Kitts, whose family is the sponsor of tonight's lecture series. Anne Marie Kitts was in many ways a trailblazer for me insofar as she went from Weston Jesuit School of Theology for her master's and continued to Johns Hopkins. And I actually met Anne Marie for the first time at Johns Hopkins when I was in coursework, and Anne Marie would come to Johns Hopkins every summer for 1 week to do research. And I was working at the information desk at the Johns Hopkins Library, and we met and realized we both had a love and admiration of Dick Clifford and also some professors at Hopkins. And it was always very meaningful to me that she would take the time at the information desk to sit and talk to me about the research topics that she was working on. And so those conversations were, to have a senior scholar take the time to stop and chat with somebody who's in coursework was just a very meaningful moment in my academic formation. So not just for Dick, but also for Anne Marie, it's great to be here tonight speaking at a lecture series that they have sponsored and in their honor. So with that in mind, a mentor in biblical studies once told me that our field is 5 years behind any trend. Whatever topic is hot in other fields, just wait 5 years, and it will finally have trickled down to biblical studies. Certainly, biblical scholars would not want their work to be too timely or relevant. Better to wait 5 years, let the world move on before we take up something. I once shared this truism during a job interview, and the interviewer chuckled and said, more like 10 years. I nodded my head agreeably and echoed her chuckle because that's a good thing to do in job interviews. So that gives us a range of 5 to 10 years, which means it's now over 6 years past the Jubilee year for mercy declared by Pope Francis in 2016. So the time is perfect for a biblical talk on mercy. That's what I have prepared for you tonight, and my talk is inspired by my perception, based on what I've read in conversations with students and colleagues, that the Old Testament is a somewhat overlooked resource for Christian reflection on divine mercy. There are exceptions to this overall impression, but most discussions of mercy simply mention the various Hebrew words related to it and move on to other theological resources. Some discussions do not mention the Old Testament at all. Part of this lacuna is the fault of Old Testament scholars who don't take the time to make its riches available to wider audiences, or only do so 5 to 10 years later. My talk tonight is an attempt to fill this lacuna by offering my reflections on mercy in the Old Testament, not as a corrective to any of the excellent scholarship that came out before, during, and after the 2016 Year of Mercy, but as a supplement. My hope is that by the end of tonight's talk, you will have a deeper understanding of mercy in the Old Testament and be inspired to integrate its language and imagery into your theology and spirituality. My talk has 4 parts. First, I will discuss the semantics of the main biblical term, main Hebrew word for mercy, raḥamim, and the unique opportunities it offers for theological reflection. Second, I will discuss some of the implications of moving from etymology to theology. Third, I will compare the biblical presentation of divine mercy to its presentation in Mesopotamian texts. Fourth, I will discuss the difference between raḥamim and another theological word in the Old Testament, Hessed. The two are related and sometimes occur together, but it is important to recognize the differences between them. So, part 1. Before looking at Hebrew raḥamim, we can begin by noting that various ancient languages associate mercy with a part of the body. For example, we are all familiar with the heart imagery of Latin misericordia, which persists in quite a few modern language. And one of the words for mercy in ancient Greek is splagna, which denotes a person's entrails. This location of mercy in the body, according to the Greek language, is not always apparent in translations of the New Testament, which often render splagna with a less visceral word, like heart. In this regard, you have to admire the King James Version for its numerous references to bowels, as when Paul asked Philemon to, quote, refresh my bowels in the Lord, end quote. More recent translations like the NRSV and NAB take a let's gutsy approach and render the line, refresh my heart in Christ, which is understandable, but loses the visceral quality of mercy expressed in Paul's use of the word splagna. Hebrew raḥamim is likewise a deeply embodied word, but rather than heart or viscera, this ancient word for mercy is derived from a 3-consonant root, resh, chet, mem, whose base meaning is womb. The Hebrew word for womb itself, reḥem, derives from this root, as do other Hebrew words related to mercy, like recham, the verb recham, to have pity, or the adjective rahum, merciful, as in the Lord is kind and merciful. The word for merciful there is rahum. The same is true for other Semitic languages, such as Akkadian, where the noun remu denotes womb as well as pity, compassion, mercy. And I'll talk about this more in section 3. To me, this association between the womb and mercy is an aspect of biblical theology that has not been appreciated enough. And it is the first key point I would make about mercy in the Old Testament, namely that it is a distinctly maternal quality. When God extends raḥamim to Israel, God is providing the kind of care that children receive in the mother's womb. This language and imagery from the Old Testament can enrich our theology in numerous ways. For one thing, God's raḥamim is an important example of feminine divine imagery in the Bible. We are all aware that masculine imagery and language for God dominate the Bible, and that there are precious few references to God's feminine traits. In light of this disparity, it is crucial that we highlight the instances of feminine divinity we do have. Biblical raḥamim is one of those instances. Perhaps the most explicit and poignant expression of this aspect of God comes in 2nd Isaiah, that is chapters 40 through 55 of the book of Isaiah, where the prophet comforts the exiled Judeans in Babylon by comparing Yahweh's mercy to a mother's care for the child of her womb. This is text number 1 on your handout. Sing out, O heavens, and rejoice, O earth. Break forth in song, O mountains. For Yahweh has comforted his people. Yahweh has shown mercy, raḥem, to the poor. Zion has said, Yahweh has forgotten me. My Lord has forsaken me. My Lord has forgotten me. Can a mother forget her baby or withhold mercy, raḥem, from the child of her womb? These may forget, but I will not forget you. With its double reference to the verbal form of the root raḥem, in combination with the Hebrew word beten, which is a common synonym for the noun raḥem, this passage highlights the womb imagery that underlies divine mercy in the Old Testament. I will say more about these verses later, but for now we can note that they are one of the best expressions of the distinctly maternal quality of biblical mercy and the feminine side of the God of Israel. Secondly, the connection between the womb and divine mercy in the Old Testament can be a resource for developing a more embodied theology and anthropology. According to this biblical perspective, mercy, both divine and human, is not an abstract ideal to which we ascend. Rather, it is something rooted in the divine body and in the bodies of human beings made in God's image. It is not out there, but in here. This embodied quality of mercy is highlighted in Isaiah chapter 63, verse 15, which is number 2 on your text. There, the people complain to Yahweh, your me'amim and your raḥamim are being withheld from us. What they desire is Yahweh's presence in the concrete. We might even say incarnational way. This word pair shows that far from an external ideal, Hebrew raḥamim was, similar to Greek splagna, visceral. And the word me'amim means entrails. It's the closest Hebrew term for Greek splagna. So also like splagna, this visceral quality is often lost in translation, as we see in modern renderings of me'amim and raḥamim as yearning and love. Further evidence of this embodied quality is the use of the verb kamar, meaning to grow warm, with raḥamim. In Genesis chapter 43, verse 30, which is not on your handout, but this is from the Joseph story. When Joseph is overwhelmed at the sight of his full brother Benjamin, we are told that his raḥamim grew warm. Again, modern translations have a hard time conveying this corporeality, as we see in the New American Bible and the New Revised Standard Version that render this phrase, he was overcome with affection. This translation is fine, but it does not go far enough in conveying the somatic character of the Hebrew original. A better translation might have been, he grew warm-hearted. Or as Dr. Jamie Waters, my colleague, suggested to me when she read a draft of this, he had a fire in his belly, which I think is getting closer to the original Hebrew. In any event, attention to this aspect of mercy in the Old Testament is an invitation to be mindful of our own bodies in relationship with other people and with God. Indeed, the biblical author's description of Yahweh's body, including the womb as a locus of divine mercy, has profound theological implications for how we think about ourselves as being made in God's image and likeness. Although the divine body of Yahweh in the Old Testament is not a literal body like that of Jesus in the New Testament, even as a theological metaphor, it invites us to see our bodies as something that unites us with God. Thirdly, the womb imagery of the Old Testament adds unique nuance to our understanding of divine mercy. For one thing, it says something about the universal scope of Yahweh's mercy. Unlike Hessed, which I will discuss later, which is the basis of Yahweh's special covenantal relationship with Israel, divine raḥamim as a metaphor is rooted in God's parental relationship with every human being. More specifically, in the experience shared by all humankind of being nurtured in a mother's womb. This scope is expressed well in Psalm 145, verses 8 and 9, which is on your handout. It begins with a covenantal formula: Yahweh is kind and merciful, raḥam, slow to anger, great in fidelity, Hessed, but then proclaims God's mercy to all creatures. Yahweh is good to all. His mercy, raḥamim, is over all his works. These two verses articulate Yahweh's unique covenantal chesed with Israel, as well as Yahweh's mercy for Israel, raḥum, and all creation, raḥamim. To me, it is significant that the language of divine love extended to all creation is drawn from the universal experience of prenatal maternal care. At the same time, the womb imagery also says something about our human status vis-a-vis God's mercy, namely that we are in a state of total dependence on it. According to the womb imagery implied by Hebrew raḥamim, humans are dependent on God's mercy the same way unborn children are dependent on the safety and nourishment they receive in the womb. There is other theological language in the Old Testament which speaks of the responsibilities of humans to be stewards of God's creation and agents of God's justice. But its theology of mercy stresses humans' reception of divine love rather than their collaboration to establish justice and righteousness in the world. I'll return to this point a little bit later in my discussion of raḥamim and chesed. So moving from etymology to theology, this association between mercy and the womb has not gone unnoticed by biblical scholars, but there has been disagreement over the extent to which the association should be understood. The key question is how much a word's etymology should govern its meaning in a given text. Can we presume that womb imagery in every instance of raḥamim? Or was there a point where raḥamim became detached from its etymology and simply meant mercy? On the one hand, there are scholars like Phyllis Tribble who take a maximalist view of womb imagery in relation to Yahweh's mercy. In her groundbreaking 1978 book, God and the Rhetoric of Sexuality, Tribble connected many instances of the noun raḥamim and the verb reḥem to the womb and concluded, and this is a quote on your handout, that with persistence and power, the root reḥem journeys throughout the traditions of Israel to establish a major metaphor for biblical faith, semantic movement from the wombs of women to the compassion of God. More recently, Wilda C. Gaffney has lamented that the translation of raḥamim as compassion obscures its underlying imagery. She writes, "The only reproductive organ ascribed to God in the biblical text is a womb. Often the love God feels for humanity is expressed as emanating from the womb, reḥem, using the verb raḥam, unfortunately regularly translated compassion," end quote. On the other hand, there are scholars who are less sanguine about the persistence of womb imagery in raḥamim. Their caution is based on what James Barr has called the root fallacy, which places excessive emphasis on the meaning of the root of Hebrew words. He writes, and this is a quote on your text handout also, "It seems to be commonly believed that in Hebrew there are root meanings, which are effective throughout all variations given to the root by affixes and formative elements. And therefore, the root meaning can confidently be taken to be part of the actual semantic value of any word or form, which can be assigned to an identifiable root." Barr himself doesn't cite biblical raḥamim as an example of root fallacy, but the doubt he casts on the correlation between a word's etymology and its meaning has been an important corrective within the field of biblical studies and has been applied by other scholars to raḥamim. Here, for example, is Meyer Gruber's criticism of Tribble's view, which I just quoted, and this is also in your handout. He says, "Tribble's assertion seems to rest upon the questionable assumption that native speakers of Hebrew were fully conscious of the etymological relationship of the verb reḥem, to be compassionate, and the noun reḥem, womb, whenever they heard or employed the verb reḥem or the adjective raḥum. Native speakers of a language tend to be far less conscious of the etymological history of words or the origin of idioms than are preachers, philologists, and students of Hebrew as a foreign language." I think I'm counted in that last category. Just as anthropologists 1,000 years from now would be wrong to presume that English speakers today whose weekdays are named after Norse deities had a special devotion to Thor on Thursday, i.e. Thor's Day. Just so, we cannot presume that every instance of Hebrew word raḥamim was meant to evoke womb imagery. So how do we mediate between these two opposing views? For this question, Barr offers some advice in the same book where he discusses the root fallacy, though in truth, most of his book is devoted to criticizing bad methodology than it is to establishing guidelines for good scholarship. Still, he does give one piece of advice, which is to work at the level of the sentence and to focus less on individual words, but on the meaning generated by the collection of words in a sentence. For our study of mercy in the Old Testament, I think this means not assuming womb imagery for every instance of raḥamim, but demonstrating it through other features of the same verse or passage. Based on this methodology, there are at least 3 instances of raḥamim which explicitly evoke the imagery. The first is Isaiah 49, 13 through 15, which I discussed a few minutes ago. Here we have the verb reḥem, to have mercy, in verse 13. And then in verse 15, the verb is repeated as part of the prophet's comparison of Yahweh to a mother's mercy to the child of her womb. Notably, these verses are a continuation of the womb imagery that began at the very beginning of chapter 49, where the servant describes the Jeremiah-like call he received in his mother's womb. The word for womb there and in verse 15 is not reḥem, but beten, but it nonetheless informs our interpretation of the verb reḥem here. In these verses, the womb-like quality of divine mercy is more than a function of etymology, but a feature reinforced by multiple elements of the passage. The same is true for Jeremiah 31:20, where we find the same verb, reḥem, combined with the descriptions of Yahweh's parental affection and internal organs. In this verse, Yahweh says through the prophet, and this is on your handout, "Is Ephraim a precious son to me, a delightful child of mine? Whenever I have words against him, I still remember him always. Thus my insides roil, hamu hameah, for him. I will surely have mercy upon him. Raḥem arukamenu." This verse is set within a section that combines multiple images of parents and children. A few verses before this one, Yahweh described the heartbreaking sound of Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted. And a few verses after this one, Yahweh addresses Israel as a wayward daughter and calls for her return. Set within these poignant images of parents in distress is Yahweh's proclamation of parental mercy for Ephraim. This mercy is a deeply embodied experience for God. It is described first in the divine insides roiling, or more literally, bowels rumbling. Or as Winnie the Pooh would say, there is a rumbly in my tumbly. That's for somebody in the front. The word for bowels, me'amim, is the same one we saw in the combination of raḥamim in Isaiah 63. And here again, it situates us deep inside the divine body. The verb chama is used elsewhere in Jeremiah to compare to the din of an army attacking or the roaring of waves. Remarkably, the only place in the Old Testament where we find this exact same phrase of insides roiling is in the Song of Songs, where the female lover uses the phrase to describe her feeling in the presence of her beloved. So think of the butterflies of first love. The line after this description of Yahweh's bowels rumbling for Ephraim is where we encounter the language of divine mercy. The two lines combine to make a couplet and represent an example of synonymous parallelism, which in this case is semantic parallelism. Both lines are getting at the same idea. Thus, Yahweh's proclamation of mercy for Ephraim is not a disembodied feeling of compassion or pity, but a deeply somatic experience of divine love. As with Isaiah 49, the combination of the verb reḥem with descriptions of parenthood and Yahweh's visceral yearning for Israel indicates that the womb imagery of Jeremiah 31:20 is more than a function of etymology. It is part of the passage's overall depiction of mercy as something that emanates from the deep recesses of the divine body and is related to Yahweh's maternal disposition towards Ephraim. I can't take too much credit for these two examples just discussed, because they were already cited by Tribble and others in their discussion of divine mercy, though none of them make the connection to Winnie the Pooh. I would like to add here an example of my own, though, which I have not seen mentioned in scholarship, but makes an important contribution, I think, to our understanding of raḥamim. It is a line from the famous story of Solomon judging between two women who both claimed to be the mother of a certain baby. After Solomon's decision to split the baby, we read that the woman who was the actual mother was stirred with compassion. This is the New American Bible translation. This mother was stirred with compassion. The Hebrew behind this phrase, though, is much more visceral. The word translated here, compassion, is raḥamim. As you would probably guess, is the same, and the verb is the same one mentioned earlier, to grow warm. What's being described here is the somatic reaction of a mother whose baby's life is at risk. Although the author of the story uses the noun raḥamim rather than reḥem, the mother-child relationship is at the heart of the story, and the use of the verb kamar strongly suggests that the mother's womb is the locus of the raḥamim she feels. Remarkably, the womb imagery implied in the Hebrew of 1 Kings 3:26 becomes explicit in the Greek Septuagint translation of this verse, which renders the Hebrew word raḥamim with the Greek word womb, metra, which is derived from the Greek word for mother, mater, found in Solomon's judgment in 3:27. Most instances of raḥamim are translated with the Greek word oiktermos or eleos, but the Hellenistic translators of 1 Kings 3:26 read this verse as a reference to the mother's womb. Either their copy of the Hebrew text had reḥem instead of raḥamim, or the translators interpreted the reference to raḥamim, especially as growing warmth, as a reference to her womb. In either case, their translation shows that the womb imagery of Hebrew raḥamim was not only a matter of the word's etymological origins, but was also part of the word's reception by later Jewish translators, who connected this woman's feeling of mercy for her baby with the womb that had given birth to the child in the first place. All of these examples follow James Barr's advice of establishing the semantic value of a word at the level of the sentence rather than basing it solely on etymology. The examples show that in some instances of the Hebrew raḥamim, the word is used together with other references to viscera and motherhood. I think the combination allows us to assume that the authors of these texts knew the word's etymology and enlisted it as part of their rhetoric and theology. Comparative evidence from Mesopotamia. Because tonight's talk is sponsored by Dr. Anne Marie Kitts, who has done so much wonderful comparative analysis of the Old Testament in its larger ancient Near Eastern setting, I can't resist citing a few examples from Mesopotamia which exhibit the same semantics, rhetoric, and theology. As I noted at the outset of this talk, the Akkadian word for womb, remu, is cognate with Hebrew reḥem, and is actually the same word for mercy in Akkadian. So in Akkadian, it's not a matter of etymology as in Hebrew, but it's a matter of the one Akkadian word signifying both womb and mercy. Consider, for example, this line, this broken line from an old Babylonian prayer. It's on your handout, which says, "I will proclaim you like a father who begat me, show mercy, rema, like the mother who birthed me." As in the biblical example cited a few minutes ago, this Babylonian prayer to Ishtar connects the goddess's mercy with the womb imagery embedded in the word remu. The design mercy sought by the prayer is comparable to the care she received in the womb of her own mother at the time of her birth. Significantly, however, this divine mercy in ancient Mesopotamia is not unique to female deities like Ishtar, but is also sought from male deities. In a prayer to the god Marduk from around the same time, we find this extraordinary combination of fierceness and mercy. This is on your handout too. Marduk, your stare is a serpent, a massive flood, an onslaught of the fire god, where is your equal? In your fury, you can be kind. Your mercy, Rimu, like a father. Here we find the word Remu invoked as an aspect of Marduk's fatherhood and a counter image to the deity's destructive fury. What is significant about this reference is that it shows how this divine attribute, which was drawn from the life experience of women, came to be applied to a male deity and associated with the care of a father. In this way, it may offer a parallel to the way that feminine attributes came to be attached to Yahweh in the Old Testament. Of course, we cannot know if Remu in this prayer to Marduk includes womb imagery implied by its etymology. The root fallacy is just as much of a pitfall in Mesopotamian literature as it is in the Old Testament. But I think it is telling that the Remu sought from Marduk remains associated with a parent's love, as it was with Ishtar. Only in Marduk's case, it's the love of a father rather than a mother. This extension of womb-like mercy to both parents is explicit in a line from another prayer, this time to the deities Nabu and Tashmetu, a male and female counterpart. The prayer includes the petition that, quote, the divine father and divine mother who gave birth to him will show Remu to him. As in the other texts we've looked at this evening, this prayer highlights the maternal quality of divine mercy, and its reference to childbirth makes it likely that Remu here was meant to evoke the word's womb imagery. But here we also find the father thrown into the mix. To me, this incantation is a fascinating snapshot of divine mercy that conveys its corporeality and its original connection to the womb, but has begun to extend this divine feature to other deities. This snapshot is instructive for how we think about the womb-like mercy becoming an attribute of Yahweh, a male deity. Just as the authors of these Babylonian prayers could imagine male deities like Marduk and Nabu embodying Remu, the biblical prophets Jeremiah and 2nd Isaiah could envision Yahweh offering Israel womb-like raḥamim that a pregnant woman provides to her unborn child. So before moving on to my last section, let me summarize what I consider to be the key insights from the preceding sections on mercy in the Old Testament and Mesopotamia. First, the principal Hebrew word for mercy, raḥamim, is derived from a Semitic root whose base meaning is womb. According to this etymology, the mercy that God gives to humankind and we give to others is modeled on the perfect sustenance babies receive in their mother's womb. Second, we cannot assume that every instance of Hebrew raḥamim was meant to evoke this imagery. Just as we today use many words without knowledge of their etymologies, some biblical authors may have been ignorant of raḥamim's underlying womb imagery. Third, in some cases, we have contextual clues that strongly indicate the author's awareness and use of the root meaning and imagery of raḥamim. In the examples we looked at, the noun raḥamim and the verb reḥem were used in combination with references to the womb or other viscera and with references to maternal care. In these cases, I think we can be confident that the biblical authors were mindful of the connection between divine mercy and womb and made this connection part of their rhetoric and theology. Fourth, based on the examples that clearly evoke the womb imagery of raḥamim, we are justified in making this part of our theological reflection of divine mercy, even though that imagery is probably not present in all instances of the root reḥem. The handful of clear examples make the womb an unquestionable feature of the biblical presentation of divine mercy and invites us to incorporate it into our own theological imaginations. Fifth and last, comparison to the cognate term Remu in Mesopotamian prayers and incantation shows that this theological attribute, like raḥamim, emanated from the divine womb. But this original setting is not overly determinative for Mesopotamian authors who use the womb imagery for both female and male deities. Origins and etymologies only tell us part of the story. They mark a beginning, but what Akkadian Remu and Hebrew raḥamim come to mean to ancient authors depends on their own theological imaginations and creativity. The same is true for us. To recognize the connection between divine mercy and womb in the Old Testament is not to land on a fixed meaning. Rather, the recognition is an invitation to let this dimension of biblical mercy inform our own theological imagination and reflection on our experience of divine mercy. So the last part of my talk tonight draws a distinction between Hebrew mercy, raḥamim, and another important theological concept in the Old Testament, Hessed, which is most often translated love, kindness, loving kindness, steadfast love, or fidelity. These two words occur, so raḥamim and Hessed occur together in numerous biblical passages. So there is no doubt that they are related, but it is important to distinguish between them because they are not the same, as is sometimes implied in discussions of them. It doesn't help that some English translation obscure the distinction by rendering Hessed as mercy. This mistranslation is especially prevalent, unfortunately, in the New American Bible. Out of the 240 or so instances of Hessed in the Old Testament, the NAB translates it as mercy 142 times, and 126 of those instances come in the book of Psalms. I can't figure out this distribution. I don't know why the New American Bible has this unique quirk of translating Hessed as mercy and why it is especially prominent in the book of Psalms, but it is. So this idiosyncrasy has implications for our prayer and liturgy, since the New American Bible is the translation used for the Catholic lectionary and the divine office. The main distinction between Hessed and raḥamim is that Hessed denotes reciprocal obligations in a committed relationship, while raḥamim is something that goes above and beyond what you could rightly expect from God or someone else. In the Old Testament, Hessed, which Catherine Doob-Sockenfeld defines as responsibility in a relationship, is the foundation of the covenant between Yahweh and Israel. At Sinai, Yahweh revealed God's self as the one who does Hessed to the 1,000th generation to those who love me and keep my commandments. Implied in this revelation is that Yahweh expects Israel to do its part to maintain the covenant. Divine Hessed is a gift that Yahweh offers Israel, but it is also one that comes with expectations. This reciprocity is explicit in a verse like Deuteronomy 7:12, in which Yahweh says, quote, "If you obey these ordinances, observing them, doing them, then Yahweh your God will keep the covenant with you and the Hessed he swore to you." Thus, Hessed is about fidelity to commitments one has made to somebody else or to God, whether between two humans, as between Ruth and Naomi in the book of Ruth, or between Yahweh and a person like Yahweh and David, or between Yahweh and a people like Israel. Our belief in divine Hessed is our trust that Yahweh will be faithful to the promises God has made to us, and we in return will respond to God's fidelity with our own faithfulness, however asymmetrical that reciprocity might be. Biblical raḥamim, by contrast, is not a matter of established responsibilities between two parties. It is not based on a formal arrangement, and there is no expectation of reciprocity. Divine raḥamim involves Yahweh going beyond what Israel could rightly expect from their God, and showing Israel the kind of care that an expectant mother provides the child of her womb. The child is in a state of total dependency on the mother with no way to reciprocate her care. The baby can only receive the gratuitous love that only the mother's body can provide. How does this distinction between Hessed and raḥamim affect our reading of biblical passages? Well, let's look at one instance where the two words occur together. This is the verse 3 of Psalm 51, which I think is the last text on your handout. This is a famous penitential psalm where the speaker says, "Show me your favor, O God, according to your Hessed. According to your abundant raḥamim, blot out my sin." Clearly, Hessed and raḥamim are closely related. Not only do they occur in synonymous parallelism, but they actually stand next to each other in the text at the center of the verse's A-B-B-A pattern and are set in identical prepositional phrases. On the other hand, the words are tied to two very different divine actions, and I think it is possible to see in them a two-step sequence. First, the speaker hopes that God's Hessed will put God in a favorable disposition. But the big ask is for God to blot out the speaker's sin. This request is one that the speaker speaks again in verse 11, asking again that God will blot out his iniquities. This divine purification goes above and beyond the covenantal chesed Yahweh promised to Israel. The hope is for this kind of restoration lies in God's raḥamim, indeed in Yahweh's abundant mercy. Later in the psalm, the speaker acknowledges that any divine punishment that would come from Yahweh would be justified, saying to God, "You are just in your decision and blameless in your judgment." The speaker's failure to reciprocate Yahweh's chesed means that Yahweh is not obliged to continuing offer any divine chesed. Accordingly, the speaker's request is not for Yahweh to keep covenantal promises. The endurance of the covenant in the wake of Israel's disobedience is not a matter of chesed, but raḥamim. The plea in Psalm 51 is for God to go beyond meeting the speaker halfway and to respond to the speaker's failure with mercy instead of justice. Even more than the asymmetry of the covenantal relationship, the speaker is in a position of total dependency on Yahweh's mercy, not unlike the dependency of an unborn child in the mother's womb. Indeed, divine mercy in Psalm 51 involves nothing short of the speaker's rebirth, highlighted by the language of recreation in verse 12. There, the word for create, bara, is the same Hebrew word used only of God's creation, and the reference to spirit, ruach, in the same verse likewise alludes to divine creation. I want to avoid pressing too hard on the distinction between chesed and raḥamim. As I noted earlier, they occur together in synonymous parallelism and in other biblical verses. They occur as a word pair that might even be hendiadys, that is to say, one concept expressed through two words. My point is that despite their interrelatedness, the two divine attributes are not one and the same. They come out of different divine metaphors for God and invite different ways of thinking about and relating to God. If we conflate them entirely, we risk losing the distinctive contribution each one makes to biblical theology. Let me conclude my talk on raḥamim in the Old Testament by returning to the verses from Isaiah 49, which I've discussed a couple of times this evening. These are my favorite of the examples, actually, where Zion says, Yahweh has forgotten me, my Lord has forsaken me, my Lord has forgotten me. Can a mother forget her baby or withhold mercy from the child of her womb? These may forget, but I will not forget you. I return to this passage because it gives me a chance to close my lecture by giving the last word to the honoree of tonight's lecture, Richard Clifford, S.J., from his book on 2nd Isaiah, Fair Spoken and Persuading. I first read this book in Dick's Isaiah seminar, which I took in my first semester at the Weston Jesuit School of Theology. And it was that class and that book that definitively turned me on to the Old Testament. And I just knew after Dick's instruction and after reading the book of Isaiah that the Old Testament was the place for me. And so this book, Fair Spoken and Persuading, has always had a special place in my heart. And so Dick's book on 2nd Isaiah, this is his comment on this passage. He says, quote, "To Zion's complaint that Yahweh has forgotten her, Yahweh claims his maternal instinct towards his child," end quote. I couldn't agree more with Dick on this point. And in many ways, my talk tonight is an expansion of his insight into Yahweh's maternal instinct. I'm grateful to Dick for this insight and for the countless other ways that he has given us insights in his writing and in teaching. And I'm grateful to all of you for your time and for your attention this evening. Thank you. Thank you. So the practice of these continuing ed talks, as many of you know, is after the talk to take some time to chat with a neighbor about something from the talk that seemed interesting or maybe you disagreed with or just something that stimulated you. And so before we go to Q&A, please take just maybe 5 minutes to turn to your neighbor and just share some parts of the talk or some questions that you had, and then I'll call you in 5 minutes, and we can have an open Q&A session. Any questions or comments before we break for the evening? I think Julia has a microphone, and so if you have a comment or question and want to raise your hand. Oh, and Joe also.
Thank you for the great lecture. I really enjoyed it. I think one thing I'm still sitting with, I think the imagery I can't say it with the Hebrew accent.
That's right.
Of
Rahamim.
Rahamim, yes. It's really beautiful, and seeing God as a mother and like this womb imagery is beautiful when thinking about the Old Testament. But I'm thinking like colloquially, like when people think about God of the Old Testament, in quotation marks, they think of a God of like, you will get punished for doing the wrong thing, or thinking about like the Deuteronomistic history of like, if you do the wrong thing, if you don't obey the covenant, exile. So how do you balance those images of this merciful God who it goes beyond like that covenantal relationship, like he's extending this mercy with other images of like retribution, and I don't know if I'm asking this correctly. But
No, I get you. Thank you, Ivina, for that question. I think just leaning, a part of it, I mean, as you know from classes with me, I trying to lean into these more positive images and highlight them. And I mean, the Old Testament has no shortage of passages expressing divine anger and judgment. And that's an important part of what the Old Testament offers, is Yahweh's outrage at injustice and corruption, etc. But I think that, you know, the counterbalance to this throughout the Old Testament is this restorative side of Yahweh, restoring the people, finding ways to rebuild the people and offer love to the people. And I think that this is a key contribution to that more restorative perspective of the Old Testament. And so to kind of hold these up as a counterbalance to this sometimes caricature of the Old Testament, I think is important.
So I'm kind of wondering about what do we do with the Old Testament's embodied language to describe God? Is it that the authors just couldn't that was the resources that we have to describe God's feelings is our own feelings, or do we take it more literally? Because I guess we could say, somehow God feels the way that we feel more maximally than minimally.
Thank you, James. I mean, so the kind of question of anthropomorphism I think for them, they were thinking about God not as some philosophical abstraction, but something that felt very close and tactile and present to them in a very concrete way. And I think, for Christians, this is something that Michael Visegrad, a Jewish theologian, makes this point, that the incarnation of the New Testament is not entirely without precedent in the Old Testament. There is a way that Yahweh is present in a very concrete way among Israel as they're traveling through the desert and in the land, that the divine presence is not some abstraction, but is a very concrete presence. And he actually makes the connection between that concrete presence and the incarnation in the New Testament. And so I think it's an important point of continuity between how God is revealed in the New Testament and how God is revealed in the Old Testament. As far as the anthropomorphism, what's fascinating about the Old Testament and ancient Israel is that they had this aniconic tradition, so they refused to depict Yahweh in any sort of graphic medium. And so images, graphic depictions are all forbidden, but in their literature, there are abundant references to the divine body. So they don't mind talking about the divine arm as the arm that saves Israel in the Exodus, or God's back or hand or face. I mean, divine face is all over the place. And so the biblical authors were very free in describing literarily the divine body, but in artistic tradition, it was totally forbidden. And so, exactly what they were thinking, why was one type of embodiment permissible, but another type of embodiment forbidden? I mean, there's been a lot of different opinions given on kind of anthropologically trying to understand where this is coming from. But in the end, I don't know if we'll ever know for sure, but they were very much envisioning their deity as one who had a bodily form. Yes. Do you want to wait for the microphone? Just so we...
Hi. Hi. I just was curious, just triggered by what you just said about how in the Old Testament, it was you were not to put into iconography God's face. That's very similar to the Islamic tradition in the geometry. Just curious. Well, this is off topic for you, but that just was sort of I had never heard that before about Judaism and the Old Testament. So it was fascinating to me. Although the language, of course, yes.
Right, yes. Yeah, it is an interesting sort of interreligious connection between the prohibition on images of Muhammad and prohibition of images. So there would be an example of iconic traditions that again, get expressed differently, but is rooted in the same prohibition of images.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Professor Davis, for such a wonderful lecture. I wanted to know if you have considered any possibility of a connection with the bosom of Abraham or Jesus' bosom in John's Gospel.
Thanks, Fernando. I really haven't, to be honest with you. As you know, the New Testament is not my strong suit. So, but I appreciate the suggestion. I haven't thought about it, but I will, based following your suggestion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for a wonderful lecture. Going back to something that you said about Dick Clifford, who did model the kind of scholarship that bears fruit in many ways in ministry. Mm-hmm. I'm just wondering if you have any suggestions for how what you talked about tonight and the particular images of God and God's mercy could be important in particular pastoral ministerial contexts, and that could be anything. But just to make that connection, I would invite.
Thank you. I mean, for me, one thing that I try to stress when I teach is that as I read the Old Testament theologically, what I am always struck by is how innovative Yahweh is in constantly finding new ways to reach out to Israel. That when something's not working, Yahweh is willing to try something new. And to me, divine mercy, it's related maybe a lot to parenting, that parenting, there's no one size fits all in parenting, and that Yahweh is not one size fits all in sort of being in relationship with Israel. But Yahweh is constantly trying new things, and I think it's very spiritually and theologically and pastorally consoling to imagine that whatever is happening in our lives, wherever we think our relationship with God happens to be, that there's no limit to the different ways that God will make God's self available to us. And that maybe something isn't working, but that doesn't mean that tomorrow God won't try some new way to reach out to us. And I just find that the overall story of the Old Testament is God looking for new ways to be in a relationship with Israel and not being content with just doing the same old thing over and over again. So I think to offer that to people pastorally would be good news, to say that you just never know the ways that God is going to reach out to you. And so to think about mercy in that way, as God going above and beyond what God has promised to do. God will always keep God's promises, but God is also willing to go beyond those promises in ways that could totally surprise you.
All right, we have a couple questions here from the online audience. First, a chaplain educator said to the new student chaplains, when you enter the patient room, Hessed enters the room. Was that the correct expression?
Oh, I hate to disagree with someone. I guess I would have to hear more about the context. My instinct is to say no, actually. I hate to say that. But Hesed presumes prior relationship, that Hesed is relational, that if you don't know someone and there's no relationship, it's hard to have Hesed, that Hesed kind of presumes an existing relationship and commitment between two people, that you have all obligations reciprocal. And so I think there would be a different maybe Hebrew word to describe that, what the minister is bringing into the room. Maybe raḥamim.
Great, thank you. Similar kind of your commentary on some word choice. Does the word raḥamim have a different connotation when paired with justice?
That's a good question. I can't think offhand of an instance where mishpat and raḥamim occur together. Nothing occurs offhand of their combination, but I'd have to look up for an instance of that. So I don't know.
Okay. One more. Phyllis Tribble grew up Southern Baptist and in her mature scholarship drew upon the fundamental conviction that the biblical word is communicative from God to us. If I read her correctly, the conscious choice of biblical writers to employ the rhetoric of the divine womb is not as decisive as God's desire to communicate God's merciful compassion and love in this self-disclosure. The persistence of the image of God as enwombed reflects not redactors' options as much as divine persistent love. Please comment.
Yeah. Amen is my comment. That's great. I mean that divine persistence is what I was kind of trying to say also in my answer to Mick's question. I totally agree. And actually, and Phyllis Tribble was a Southern Baptist, and she is an alum of the same college where my sister went, Meredith College in Raleigh, North Carolina, my hometown. And Miss Morton is also a Southern Baptist. I may be the only person who learned Latin from a Southern Baptist, besides my classmates at Carroll Middle School.
What about the relationship between raḥamim and forgiveness?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, the word for forgiveness in Hebrew is rooted in a different metaphor. The main Hebrew word, I mean, there's a great book on sin by Gary Anderson where he discusses this metaphor at length, that the main metaphor for sin in the Hebrew Bible is it's a burden to carry. And so to forgive someone is to lift that burden. And so to lift in Hebrew, so often when you see the to forgive in the translation, the Hebrew behind it is to lift. And so it's kind of rooted in a different metaphor, but still an embodied one because it's really kind of Yahweh reaching out and lifting the burden that you're carrying. Yes, Noah?
Hi, Andrew. Thank you so much for your talk. In your reflection or sharing on womb imagery, one of the things that it kind of sparked in me is this notion that womb imagery doesn't just situate God as a parent and us as a child, but also situates humanity at a particular stage of childhood and a particular stage of life, which is to say, not just a child in the sense that a 40-year-old could be the child of a father who is in their 60s and such, but at a particular stage of our development. And I was just wondering if kind of the notion of human beings in relationship to God at being in that very childlike stage of life is something that featured prominently in the imagination of the folks that we read about in the Hebrew Bible, if that's something that has struck you in your studies of that emphasis on those in the Hebrew Bible being at a particular stage of development in relationship to Yahweh.
That's a great question. Thank you, Noah. I haven't thought about that. I mean, I'd have to sit and think through the examples that we have, if we find sort of language and imagery of children, especially around this. I mean, I was just thinking about, I thought about the Joseph story. I mean, he's not a child in that story when that takes place. So I don't know. I'd have to think about that some more, but I appreciate the invitation to reflect in that way.
Andrew,
Hi, Colleen.
I'd like to disagree with your opening remarks about Bible scholars being 5 and 10 years behind in this respect, because I think we're all mightily struggling to ground carefully understandings of the maternal praxis of God. And what you've done tonight certainly helps us with that in a big way. So I want to thank you for that. And I'm just wondering, the last piece on the handout you gave us coupled the two senses of mercy. And I just am wondering about the wisdom of that, the covenantal sense and the profoundly receptive sense.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to say anything about that coupling at all?
You mean in Psalm 51?
Let's see. It is Psalm 51 here. But is there a way in which these two traveling together is very wise, and our holding them together is also very wise as we theologize?
I definitely think so. I mean, I think keeping them distinct is important, but also seeing them as part of the overall, as combining for this overall, I think, expectation or way of relating to God. That Hessed and raḥamim, through raḥamim is our reception of God's mercy and love. Hessed is also sort of a divine love, but it's also one that calls us to action, I think. And so mercy is not necessarily calling us to action, I don't think, the way Hessed is, but I think that it does recognize that the action that we're called to is in response to the love that we've already received from God. And so whatever we do in the world for justice, for righteousness, for love, for mercy, is because we've received all those things from God, I think. Junhee?
Yeah. Are there negative meanings of in the Old Testament? For instance, I think Job used the motive when he curses his birth. So I'm curious, can the positive implications described in today's lecture be applied in those texts as well?
In like a negative way, you mean?
Yes, he used the motive when he curses his life or his
right. Yes, and so does Jeremiah. Both of them kind of curse the day that they came forth from the womb. And so I don't know if the word reḥem comes up in those passages, but I do think that there's a larger discourse around womb imagery. I mean, the fact that Jeremiah's call narrative comes in the womb. This is also said of the suffering servant, as I said in chapter 49. And so I think there's a much larger conversation to be had. I mean, and, you know, in the book of Hosea, we had this lo ruhamah is one of the names of Hosea's children. So there's a much kind of larger, I think, discourse taking place around the root reḥem and wombs. And this is probably just a small part of it. So I would see the connection, but it'd be a much bigger kind of exploration to take place, I think. Maybe time for one more, or no more? Going once? Okay, Colleen. Colleen gets the last word.
I don't know if it's going to be that good of a question, Andrew. In our small group, when we were discussing, we were talking about Psalm 145 that you have on here, and fidelity, and the fidelity is the translation that's given for Hessed. But we had a question about, you know, fidelity really would seem to be, you could interpret either one of these words as fidelity. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about how Hessed and raḥamim would help us to understand fidelity in two different ways. It seems to be two different sides of the same coin.
Yeah, I think that fidelity, I think Hessed fidelity is fidelity to a promise that's been made. That God makes a promise to, so at Sinai, God makes a promise to Israel I'll always have your back. And Israel makes a promise to Yahweh saying, we'll follow these commandments. And so from that time onward, Hessed is really fidelity to that commitment that was made at Sinai. Whereas I think raḥamim as fidelity is, to take this maternal imagery, is, that the unborn child is in no position to reciprocate. That there's how can this unborn child offer fidelity to this mother? So I think that there's no prior commitment, there's no prior relationship that they're remaining faithful to in the same way with Hessed. So I think it could be fidelity, but the reciprocity is much more asymmetrical and really not based on any formal arrangement as it is with Hessed. So.
All right. Please join me in thanking Dr. Davis. Thank you all for coming. Have a good evening.
Good. I'm so glad.